Good evening, listeners. My name is EveningWhisperTales. Tonight, I'll be telling you some scary horror stories to help you relax and fall asleep. If you enjoy this channel, I'd really appreciate it if you like and subscribe. Now, let's begin our evening together. Story 2. My son says someone sleeps in his bed before him. It started on a normal school morning when I went to wake him and found him already sitting upright, blanket folded carefully beside him like he'd just finished making the bed instead of sleeping in it. He looked tired in a strange way, not groggy but observant, watching the mattress like it had done something unexpected overnight. I waited this time, he told me. For what? For him to leave before I got in. I assumed he meant a dream and told him he probably just woke up early, but he shook his head and slid his hand across the sheet. It was warm again. I touched it. It was. Not body heat lingering under covers. The pillow itself was warm, and the center of the mattress carried the kind of heat someone leaves after lying still for a long time. And my wife blamed the heater vent near his wall and turned it down. But the next morning, it was the same, and the next after that. Each day, he waited, longer before climbing into bed, sitting on the floor with his back against a dresser until he decided it was safe. One night, I told him I'd check before he went to sleep. We brushed teeth, read a chapter of his book. Then I pulled the blankets back and pressed both palms firmly into the mattress. Cool. See? I said. He hesitated, then climbed in slowly like he expected the bed to react. At 2:31 a.m., I woke to the faint sound of fabric shifting down the hall. Not footsteps, weight settling. I stood outside his door and listened to the mattress compress and release in slow intervals, as though someone were carefully turning over. When I opened the door, he was asleep on the far edge, knees tucked tight to his chest. The other side of the bed dipped inward, just slightly. In the morning, the blanket on that side was folded down, tucked neatly the way adults do when they leave a bed without waking someone beside them. He looked relieved at breakfast. He left earlier today. That afternoon, we replaced the mattress. That night, he slept in ours. At 3:02 a.m., my wife nudged me awake and whispered that I'd rolled too close to the edge. I hadn't moved, but the center of the bed was occupied. Story 3. My wife keeps hearing someone walking our hallway before we get home. She first mentioned it casually while hanging up her coat, saying she thought one of us must have come home early because she heard footsteps upstairs before she opened the door. I told her I'd been at work all day and the kids were still at school, and she laughed it off, assuming she'd heard the neighbors through the walls. But the next day, she texted me while I was still driving home, asking if I was already inside. I wasn't. She said she could hear movement above her, steady pacing from the bedrooms to the stairs, back and forth like someone waiting for her to come up. I told her to wait in the car until I arrived. When I got there, the house was locked, alarm-armed, and quiet. We checked together, room by room, closet by closet. Nothing disturbed. 2 days later, the kids heard it too, while we were all still in the driveway unloading groceries. Footsteps crossing directly above us from my daughter's room to ours. We ran inside. Silence. From then on, it only happened when the house was empty. Until one evening, we came home earlier than usual and heard movement stop mid-step the moment the key turned in the lock. We didn't go in right away. We listened. Someone was standing at the top of the stairs, not walking, just waiting for us to enter. Story 4. My daughter says the playground is still there at night. We pass the old elementary school every evening on walks, and the playground has been gone for years, replaced by a flat fence field where grass struggles to grow. During the day, she never pays attention to it, but one night she stopped and stared through the fence like she was watching kids play. "They're still here," she said. I saw only empty asphalt and wind-blown leaves. She described swings moving, the metal slide, the red climbing bars that had been removed before she was born. She waved at someone near the monkey bars. I told her she was remembering pictures. That night she woke crying because she said she'd missed her turn and they'd waited for her. The next evening she insisted on stopping again. "They said you can't see them because you don't remember," she explained. When I looked again, one swing was moving. No wind, just a steady back and forth arc that stopped the moment she grabbed my hand and pulled me away. Story 5. My wife says I come home earlier than I do. She started thanking me for small things I hadn't done, bringing in the trash cans before work, turning off the hallway light, checking the back door during lunch. Each time I told her I'd been at work, and she'd stare like she was trying to reconcile two memories that both felt real. One afternoon she called, annoyed I'd left without saying goodbye after stopping home early. I checked my schedule. I'd been in a meeting across town. The security camera showed someone entering at that exact time. My height, my jacket, my walk, but they didn't use keys. They waited for the door to unlock from the inside. Story 6. My daughter keeps asking why her teacher comes here at night. It began as a normal after-school complaint. My daughter came home, dropped her backpack in the hallway, and told my wife she didn't like her substitute teacher because she talked too quietly. We didn't think much of it until she added that the teacher didn't sound like that at night. "At night when?" my wife asked while stirring pasta. "When she stands outside my room." We assumed she meant a dream. She described the woman perfectly though. The same scarf, the same crooked glasses, even the small mole near her eyebrow that I only knew about because I'd met the teacher once during pickup. Kids remember details, sure, but that didn't explain why she insisted the woman never knocked and never opened the door, just stood there, like she was listening to our breathing. That evening, I checked before bed. The hallway was empty, and I even opened the front door to reassure myself nobody had followed her home from school. The porch light showed nothing but the driveway and the quiet street. At 2:12 a.m., my wife woke me and whispered she heard someone pacing outside the bedrooms. Not footsteps exactly, more like fabric brushing the walls. We opened the door together and saw nothing, but my daughter was awake, sitting up and facing the doorway like she expected someone to still be there. "She left early," she said. "You scared her." The next day at pickup, I mentioned it lightly to the teacher. She looked confused and told me she'd been out of town all week for a conference. Another parent confirmed it. She'd only returned that morning. That night, the hallway smelled faintly like chalk dust, and my daughter thanked someone softly before falling asleep. Story 7. My son's friend waits in the driveway before school. For weeks, my son insisted we were always late because his friend was already waiting outside when he woke up. I figured he meant the neighbor kid, but every time I looked out, the driveway was empty except for our car and the trash bins. One morning, he dragged me to the window before sunrise and pointed toward the far edge near the mailbox. He described a boy standing there with a backpack, never moving closer to the porch, just watching the house like he didn't want to break a rule. I stepped outside in slippers to prove nobody was there, but my son called after me not to walk through him because it made him upset. At breakfast, he set out 2 bowls and poured cereal into both before I stopped him. Milk soaked into the second bowl untouched while he kept glancing toward the front door like he expected it to open. We installed a door camera, mostly to ease his imagination. The first morning, the motion alert triggered before any of us woke. The recording showed our driveway in the dim gray dawn, and one frame where something darker than shadow stood exactly where he'd pointed. Later that week, my son asked if his friend could come inside when winter started, because standing still hurts when it gets cold. Story 8. My wife's mother calls the house. Even though she doesn't own a phone, her mother passed away years ago, so the first call seemed like a coincidence. Just static and a faint clicking sound before the line disconnected, but the caller ID displayed her name, exactly as we'd saved it back when she still visited. My wife tried to laugh it off, but when it rang again the following evening, she answered and froze halfway through saying hello. She didn't speak for nearly a minute, just listened with her hand gripping the counter. Afterwards, she told me she'd heard breathing and a faint hum, the same lullaby her mother used to sing while cooking. No words, just the melody, and she said she'd recognized it instantly. The calls always came from different numbers, yet always displayed the same contact. When she blocked it, it rang from another line. When she unplugged the house phone, it rang from her mobile while sitting powered off on the table. The last call came at 3:07 a.m., and the voicemail contained only the sound of a chair scraping across tile. The same sound her mother's kitchen chair made every morning at breakfast. The next day, the smell of her mother's cooking filled the hallway for a few seconds before fading. Story 9. My brother says he already ate dinner with us. My brother moved in after his divorce, and for the first few weeks everything felt normal. Crowded kitchen, overlapping schedules, the kids excited to have him around again. The strange part began when he thanked my wife one night for making his favorite soup earlier. She hadn't made soup. We'd ordered takeout because everyone got home late from work and practice. He laughed, insisting he'd sat at the table an hour before we arrived, talking with the kids while she cooked. The kids looked confused because they'd been at soccer the whole time, and I'd been the one to pick them up. We brushed it off as exhaustion until the next evening when he came upstairs wiping his hands with a dish towel, telling me he'd already helped clean the kitchen. I walked in and found every dish still dirty in the sink. Later that night, the hallway camera showed him entering the kitchen at 5:12 p.m., an hour before he actually arrived home from work. The timestamp matched the moment he'd remembered eating with us. In the recording, he sat alone at the table, nodding and smiling at empty chairs as if listening to conversation. Once he even laughed and turned toward the hallway, like someone had just entered. He now refuses to be home before sunset because, as he finally admitted, whoever that is knows our routine better than I do. Story 10. My daughter says her reflection is practicing without her. We first noticed something was wrong when she stopped brushing her teeth halfway through and backed out of the bathroom, staring at the mirror as though she'd seen a stranger. She told us her reflection finished brushing after she lowered the toothbrush. We assumed imagination until she refused to enter the bathroom alone and insisted the mirror needed to catch up before she could sleep. One evening, my wife stood beside her to prove nothing was wrong. They brushed together and everything matched perfectly, until my daughter leaned down to spit and my wife grabbed my arm. In the mirror, our daughter was still standing upright. The real one wiped her mouth, confused why we suddenly pulled her away. After that, she covered mirrors, whenever possible, but reflections exist everywhere. Windows, dark TVs, even spoons. She began avoiding the kitchen at night because she said the reflection in the microwave practiced smiling longer than she did. Last week she asked if reflections could leave their person when they were ready. Story 11. My neighbor keeps returning home. Before he leaves, our neighbor across the street has a predictable routine. Leaves at 7:30, returns around 6:10. My kids wave to him every morning. One day my son waved early and I corrected him. The car was still in the driveway, except it wasn't. He pointed across the street where the neighbor was unlocking his door and walking inside it, even though moments later the real neighbor came out of the same house, got into his car, and drove away. We thought it was timing confusion until my wife called me one afternoon saying she'd just seen him arrive home while also watching him mow the lawn next door. The security camera later showed the driveway empty, yet the front door opening and closing as if someone entered anyway. Minutes later, the real neighbor pulled in and used his keys. We finally asked him if he'd ever come home and found something moved already. He went silent, then admitted he sometimes found the TV warm and a chair pulled out before he got back. Now he waits in his car for a full minute before going inside. Story 6. My daughter keeps asking why her teacher comes here at night. It began as a normal after-school complaint. My daughter came home, dropped her backpack in the hallway, and told my wife she didn't like her substitute teacher because she talked too quietly. We didn't think much of it until she added that the teacher didn't sound like that at night. At night when? My wife asked while stirring pasta. When she stands outside my room. We assumed she meant a dream. She described the woman perfectly though. The same scarf, the same crooked glasses, even the small mole near her eyebrow that I only knew about because I'd met the teacher once during pickup. Kids remember details, sure, but that didn't explain why she insisted the woman never knocked and never opened the door. Just stood there, like she was listening to our breathing. That evening I checked before bed. The hallway was empty, and I even opened the front door to reassure myself nobody had followed her home from school. The porch light showed nothing but the driveway and the quiet street. At 2:12 a.m., my wife woke me and whispered she heard someone pacing outside the bedrooms. Not footsteps exactly, more like fabric brushing the walls. We opened the door together and saw nothing, but my daughter was awake, sitting up and facing the doorway like she expected someone to still be there. She left early, she said. You scared her. The next day at pickup I mentioned it lightly to the teacher. She looked confused and told me she'd been out of town all week for a conference. Another parent confirmed it. She'd only returned that morning. That night the hallway smelled faintly like chalk dust, and my daughter thanked someone softly before falling asleep. Story 7. My son's friend. Waits in the driveway before school. For weeks my son insisted we were always late because his friend was already waiting outside when he woke up. I figured he meant the neighbor kid, but every time I looked out, the driveway was empty except for our car and the trash bins. One morning he dragged me to the window before sunrise and pointed toward the far edge near the mailbox. He described a boy standing there with a backpack, never moving closer to the porch, just watching the house like he didn't want to break a rule. I stepped outside in slippers to prove nobody was there, but my son called after me not to walk through him because it made him upset. At breakfast, he set out 2 bowls and poured cereal into both before I stopped him, milk soaked, into the second bowl untouched while he kept glancing toward the front door, like he expected it to open. We installed a door camera mostly to ease his imagination. The first morning, the motion alert triggered before any of us woke. The recording showed our driveway in the dim gray dawn, and one frame where something darker than shadow stood exactly where he'd pointed. Later that week, my son asked if his friend could come inside when winter started, because standing still hurts when it gets cold. Story 8. My wife's mother calls the house. Even though she doesn't own a phone, her mother passed away years ago, so the first call seemed like a coincidence, just static and a faint clicking sound before the line disconnected. But the caller ID displayed her name, exactly as we'd saved it back when she still visited. My wife tried to laugh it off, but when it rang again the following evening, she answered and froze halfway through saying hello. She didn't speak for nearly a minute, just listened with her hand gripping the counter. Afterwards, she told me she'd heard breathing and a faint hum, the same lullaby her mother used to sing while cooking. No words, just the melody, and she said she'd recognized it instantly. The calls always came from different numbers, yet always displayed the same contact. When she blocked it, it rang from another line. When she unplugged the house phone, it rang from her mobile while sitting powered off on the table. The last call came at 3:07 a.m., and the voicemail contained only the sound of a chair scraping across tile. The same sound her mother's kitchen chair made every morning at breakfast. The next day, the smell of her mother's cooking filled the hallway for a few seconds before fading. Story 9. My brother says he already ate dinner with us. My brother moved in after his divorce, and for the first few weeks everything felt normal. Crowded kitchen, overlapping schedules, the kids excited to have him around again. The strange part began when he thanked my wife one night for making his favorite soup earlier. She hadn't made soup. We'd ordered takeout because everyone got home late from work and practice. He laughed, insisting he'd sat at the table an hour before we arrived, talking with the kids while she cooked. The kids looked confused because they'd been at soccer the whole time, and I'd been the one to pick them up. We brushed it off as exhaustion until the next evening when he came upstairs wiping his hands with the dish towel, telling me he'd already helped clean the kitchen. I walked in and found every dish still dirty in the sink. Later that night, the hallway camera showed him entering the kitchen at 5:12 p.m., an hour before he actually arrived home from work. The timestamp matched the moment he'd remembered eating with us. In the recording, he sat alone at the table, nodding and smiling at empty chairs as if listening to conversation. Once he laughed and turned toward the hallway like someone had just entered. He now refuses to be home before sunset because, as he finally admitted, whoever that is knows our routine better than I do. Story 10. My daughter says her reflection is practicing without her. We first noticed something was wrong when she stopped brushing her teeth halfway through and backed out of the bathroom, staring at the mirror as though she'd seen a stranger. She told us her reflection finished brushing after she lowered the toothbrush. We assumed imagination until she refused to enter the bathroom alone and insisted the mirror needed to catch up before she could sleep. One evening, my wife stood beside her to prove nothing was wrong. They brushed together, everything matched perfectly, until my daughter leaned down to spit and my wife grabbed my arm. In the mirror, our daughter was still standing upright. The real one wiped her mouth, confused why we suddenly pulled her away. After that, she covered mirrors whenever possible, but reflections exist everywhere. Windows, dark TVs, even spoons. She began avoiding the kitchen at night because she said the reflection in the microwave practiced smiling longer than she did. Last week she asked if reflections could leave their person when they were ready. Story 11. My neighbor keeps returning home. Before he leaves, our neighbor across the street has a predictable routine. Leaves at 7:30, returns around 6:10. My kids wave to him every morning. One day my son waved early and I corrected him. The car was still in the driveway, except it wasn't. He pointed across the street where the neighbor was unlocking his door and walking inside, even though moments later the real neighbor came out of the same house, got into his car, and drove away. We thought it was timing confusion until my wife called me one afternoon, saying she'd just seen him arrive home, while also watching him mow the lawn next door. The security camera later showed the driveway empty, yet the front door opening and closing as if someone entered anyway. Minutes later, the real neighbor pulled in and used his keys. We finally asked him if he'd ever come home and found something moved already. He went silent, then admitted he sometimes found the TV warm and a chair pulled out before he got back. Now he waits in his car for a full minute before going inside. Story 12. My son's bus arrives twice. Every afternoon, it began with confusion over pickup times. My son insisted he'd already come home earlier in the day, even though my wife had just watched him step off the bus at the corner like always. He argued about homework. He said he'd already finished and mentioned conversations from lunch that hadn't happened yet. The next afternoon, my wife waited by the window and called me while I was still at work, telling me the bus had stopped outside 10 minutes early. She watched children get off, including our son, but instead of walking toward the house, he crossed the street and disappeared down the block. When the actual bus arrived minutes later, he stepped off again, greeting her normally. We checked the school. No early release, no duplicate routes. Our daughter finally admitted she sometimes saw him sitting in the kitchen before he got home, quietly flipping through magazines he never actually read. Once she tried talking to him and he didn't answer, just turned a page and kept reading. I reviewed our door camera. At 3:18 p.m., the door opened slightly, not enough to show a face, and someone entered. At 3:27 p.m., the real bus dropped him off. Now, every afternoon, he hesitates at the threshold, like he expects someone else to already be inside. Story 13. My wife keeps hearing a conversation we haven't had yet. She started finishing my sentences hours before I spoke them. At first it was harmless, answering questions I hadn't asked yet, laughing at jokes I only thought about making. But then she described full conversations we would have later that evening, almost word for word. One morning she told me I'd ask about the electric bill after dinner, and that she'd remind me I'd already paid it. I didn't bring it up until later that night when the thought crossed my mind and I asked exactly that. She went pale because she'd already answered earlier. The kids noticed too. She'd react to things before they happened, turning toward a dropped glass seconds before it slipped, telling our daughter to grab her backpack right before she remembered she'd forgotten it. We tried testing it. I wrote a sentence on paper and hid it in my pocket. She stared at me across the table and repeated it slowly, uncertain, as if hearing a distant echo. Now she avoids long conversations, worried she's already heard the ending. Story 14. My daughter says the park closes because they leave. We live across from a small park that empties at dusk. One evening, my daughter refused to stay after sunset, insisting the children there weren't going home. They were disappearing. She described them fading at the edges while playing, swings still moving after they were gone. I stood with her to prove it was imagination until the last boy on the slide reached the bottom, and simply wasn't there anymore. The parents nearby didn't react. They kept chatting like nothing had happened. My daughter whispered that once they all leave, someone else comes to use the playground, and that's why we shouldn't watch after dark. We stopped walking past it at night, but sometimes the sound of children playing carries through our windows long after closing hours. Story 15. My best friend keeps remembering nights. We never spent together. Ryan and I had been friends since we were kids. The kind of friendship where silence isn't awkward and conversations pick up mid-sentence even after weeks apart. That's why the first time he casually thanked me for coming over last night didn't feel strange at first. I assumed he meant a few days earlier, or maybe he was joking, but he described the evening in detail. The movie we watched, the pizza we argued over ordering, the story I supposedly told about work. I hadn't left my apartment that night. My girlfriend was there the entire time and confirmed it. Ryan laughed it off when I corrected him, though not convincingly. The next week he did it again, referencing a conversation about his job search that I'd never had. When I asked what day he meant, he pointed to the previous evening, insisting I'd sat on his couch while rain hit the windows. His roommate overheard and said he'd heard both of us talking in the living room around midnight. I checked my messages, nothing sent to Ryan that night. My girlfriend checked our photos. We'd been out together the whole evening. Still, Ryan kept recalling new shared memories, late night drives, coffee runs, even an argument we'd supposedly resolved. One night he called at 1 a.m. asking why I'd left without saying goodbye. While I was still on the phone insisting I hadn't been there, his door camera alert pinged. He sent me the clip. Someone walked past the camera into his apartment. Same height, same jacket, my walk. It turned toward the lens just before the clip ended. Ryan stopped inviting me over after that, but he still texts, occasionally saying, "It's nice we're hanging out again lately." Story 16. My girlfriend says I fall asleep before I arrive. We had a routine. I finished late shifts. She stayed up waiting, and I texted when I got home so she could finally sleep. One night she messaged me asking why I'd gone straight to bed without answering her. I was still at work. I sent a photo from the office as proof. She apologized, but the next morning she insisted she'd heard me unlock the door, walk across the living room, and lie down beside her. She even described the way the mattress dipped and the sound of my jacket brushing the chair. We blamed exhaustion until she started leaving notes for me overnight. Reminders, jokes, things to read in the morning. Each time she found them moved before I got home. Finally, she stayed awake. At 2:14 a.m., she texted me, "Hey, you just got here." I called immediately. She whispered that I was asleep beside her while my voice spoke through the phone. I heard her breathing change as she looked toward the bedroom. She asked me a question only I'd know the answer to. A pause followed. Then she screamed. When I arrived 10 minutes later, she was waiting outside the building. The bedroom door was closed and she refused to go back in because, as she put it, you were still in there and you hadn't woken up yet. Story 17. My sister says our childhood home calls her back. My sister moved out years ago, but started visiting late at night without telling anyone. I'd wake to the sound of the front door opening and find her standing in the hallway, staring toward our old bedrooms. She always claimed she felt like she'd forgotten something important. One night she brought her boyfriend, hoping he'd convince her she was imagining things. Instead, he heard footsteps upstairs even though everyone was in the living room. She said the house sounded the same as when we were kids. doors closing softly, someone running down the hall. Our names whispered through vents. She insisted she could hear our younger voices playing in the rooms. We checked recordings from a baby monitor we'd kept in storage as a makeshift camera. At 3 a.m., faint laughter echoed from the empty bedroom, followed by a child's voice asking if we were coming upstairs to play. My sister doesn't visit anymore, but sometimes she calls asking if we heard her walking through the hallway again. Story 18. My friends keep leaving one extra chair at the table. It started as a joke during our weekly Friday game nights. There were 6 of us who'd been meeting since college. Me, Daniel, Priya, Mark, Jess, and Tom. And we always squeezed around the same dining table in my apartment, arguing about rules and ordering too much food. One week, Mark pulled out a 7th chair from the hallway closet and placed it at the end. For late arrivals, he said casually. No one had been invited. We laughed and kept playing, but during the night I noticed people occasionally pausing mid-sentence, glancing toward that seat as if waiting for someone to finish talking. Once Jess apologized for interrupting before realizing nobody had spoken aloud. The next week the chair was already set when I got home from works. Daniel swore he hadn't come early. My girlfriend, who lived with me, insisted she'd found it like that when she woke up from a nap and assumed we were expecting someone. We counted plates during dinner, 7 again. None of us remembered setting the last one. When I moved it away, Priya quietly slid it back while still telling a story, as though correcting a mistake she couldn't explain. Then came the night Tom heard breathing beside him. He turned and instinctively shifted his drink over to make space, continuing a conversation we hadn't realized had stopped. We reviewed the kitchen camera the following morning. During the game, the empty chair moved slightly closer to the table, just enough that someone sitting there could lean in comfortably. No one hosts game night at my place anymore, but when we meet elsewhere, someone always counts the chairs twice before sitting down. Story 19. My girlfriend's brother already knows what I'm going to say. When I met my girlfriend's family, her younger brother seemed polite but distant. During dinner, he kept answering questions before I finished asking them. Not interrupting, just responding early, like he'd already heard me. At first it felt like coincidence until it kept happening with things he couldn't predict. I started testing it casually, asking about places I'd never mentioned wanting to visit or foods I was considering ordering. He responded instantly each time with unsettling accuracy, sometimes even correcting me before I spoke fully. Later that evening, we played a card game, and he folded his hand right before I decided to bluff. He said he'd seen that moment before and wanted to change the outcome. My girlfriend admitted he sometimes described conversations hours before they happened, especially late at night. She dismissed it as imagination until he told her I'd ask about his childhood dog, something I hadn't planned but suddenly felt compelled to bring up minutes later. When I asked him directly, he shrugged and said some evenings repeat themselves until people notice. Now whenever I visit, he greets me with same as last time, before I even open the door. Story 20. My sister's new apartment has a room none of her friends remember. Leaving, my sister invited us over to celebrate moving into her new place. 4 friends came along with me, and we explored the apartment while she cooked. At the end of the hall was a spare room she planned to turn into an office, so everyone piled inside, joking about who would sleep over first. Later in the evening, we realized Mark wasn't in the living room anymore. We assumed he'd gone home early until he stepped out of the hallway, saying he'd been waiting for us in the office for 10 minutes. The problem was, the door was closed and none of us remembered leaving him there. The next weekend, it happened again with a different friend. Every time someone entered that room alone, they insisted the rest of us had been talking with them inside moments earlier. We tested it by leaving my phone recording in the corner while we all stayed in the kitchen. The video showed the door opening slightly on its own and the sound of conversation continuing, faintly even though the room was empty. My sister keeps the door shut now, but sometimes guests still thank her for a conversation she never had. Story 21. I'm a police officer and one case keeps reopening itself. I've worked patrol long enough to know certain addresses stick with you. Some houses become landmarks in your mind, not because they're special, but because of what you saw there once. For me, it was a narrow blue house at the end of Alder Street, where we responded to a missing person report 3 winters ago. A woman had called saying her husband never came home from work. Nothing unusual at first. Car gone, phone off, unfinished dinner on the stove. We searched, wrote reports, canvassed neighbors, and eventually the case went cold. No signs of struggle, no financial movement, no sightings, there's just absence. Months later, the woman moved out. New owners renovated it, repainted, changed the yard completely. That should have been the end, except dispatch kept assigning me to it, not intentionally, just coincidence. Noise complaints, alarm triggers, wellness checks. Every time I was the responding officer, and every time I felt like I'd stepped back into the first night. The living room furniture arrangement in my memory didn't match the new owners, yet I'd still instinctively look toward the old couch location, expecting to see his jacket draped over it. One evening, a neighbor reported lights flickering inside while the family was on vacation. I entered with a partner. Everything was quiet, but the kitchen chair was pulled out and the back door unlocked from the inside. My partner said it looked staged by a burglar. I noticed the same pot still sitting on the stove. Identical brand, identical placement to the night of the disappearance. Then dispatch called my radio, asking if I'd cleared the missing person case yet. The case had been closed for years. Back at the station, I checked records. For the past month, every time I'd written a report at that address, the system automatically attached the old file number, the husband's case, as if it were still active. IT said it was a glitch. Last week I responded again after a motion alarm. The owner stood outside waiting. They'd heard footsteps upstairs while no one was home. I cleared each room. The master bedroom closet door was open. Inside hung a coat I remembered from the original report. Dark canvas with a torn pocket seam. Even though the current owners insisted it wasn't theirs, dispatch called over the radio asking for a status update. Before I could answer, another voice cut in on the same channel, calm and close like someone speaking beside me. Still here? Story 22. I work night shift at a morgue and one drawer won't stay closed. Most nights are quiet. Paperwork, low lights, ventilation humming. People assume morgue work is frightening, but it's mostly routine. Labels, storage, waiting for morning. Staff. You learn the sounds, compressors kicking on, metal contracting in the cold, distant elevator cables shifting. So when drawer 14 kept opening, I blamed the rails. It slid out an inch at first, just enough for the latch not to catch. I shut it, made a note for maintenance, and continued inventory. 10 minutes later it was open again. There was no body scheduled for that slot. I checked paperwork twice. Empty. The next shift the day tech asked why I'd moved the unidentified mail from intake to storage. I hadn't. The log showed my ID badge access at 3:11 a.m., transferring a body matching a case we never received. Security footage showed me walking to the drawer during break, but I was in the office at that time reviewing charts. The longer I worked there, the more often it happened. Tags appearing before bodies arrived, paperwork printed for cases the hospital hadn't reported yet. Drawer 14 always opened shortly before a new arrival came through intake, like it was waiting. Last week I stayed late finishing forms when the elevator delivered a gurney unexpectedly. No staff escorted it, just the cart rolling to a stop as if pushed. The attached toe tag bore tomorrow's date and my signature. Story 23. My partner and I keep getting called to a crime scene that no longer exists. We were rookies when we handled the apartment fire on Marlowe Street. 2 fatalities, suspected electrical fault, cleared within days. The building was demolished and replaced by a parking structure within the year. Yet dispatch keeps sending units there. Not daily, randomly, always late at night. Reports of smoke, screams, or alarms. The first time after demolition, we drove out expecting a mistaken address. The parking garage stood empty and silent. Dispatch insisted multiple callers described flames in the upper windows. There were no windows anymore. My partner joked about phantom calls until we noticed soot on the concrete near the elevator. Fresh, smeared like someone had touched it. Every call since has included details only someone inside the original building would know. Apartment numbers, stairwell locations, even the layout we memorized during evacuation. Last night, the radio described a person trapped on the 3rd floor balcony. There has never been a 3rd floor in the garage. We walked to the center ramp anyway. For a moment, the air smelled like burned wiring, and I heard someone coughing just beyond the echo of our footsteps. Dispatch asked for victim status. My partner looked at me and said, "You hear that too, right?" Story 24. The missing person case followed me home. I've handled a lot of missing person reports, but most end in one of 2 ways. You find them, or you stop finding new leads and eventually stop expecting the phone to ring. The Jensen case never settled into either category. A 17-year-old girl vanished walking home from her friend's house. No witnesses, no struggle, just her backpack discovered at the corner of Maple and 3rd, leaned neatly against a stop sign like she'd set it down for a moment and never returned. I was assigned primary investigator because I lived closest to the neighborhood and knew most of the families already. My partner Alvarez handled interviews while I stayed late nights, going through camera footage frame by frame. Her last confirmed image showed her passing a house at 10:42 p.m. Head down, hands in her hoodie pockets, nothing behind her but empty sidewalk. Except one frame later, there was a gap in the recording. Not static, not corruption, just a clean jump of 3 seconds. Alvarez joked the town's old cameras couldn't keep up with teenagers walking fast, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been removed rather than lost. The first time the case came home with me, it was paperwork. I'd fallen asleep on the couch with files open on my chest and woke around 2 a.m. to the faint sound of someone moving in the kitchen. My wife was asleep upstairs, and my brother, who'd been staying with us, worked overnight shifts and wasn't due back until morning. I walked in expecting to find a window open or the dog pacing. Instead, the backpack sat on the kitchen chair. Same brand, same torn zipper seam I remembered from the evidence photos. I blinked and it was gone, leaving only my cold coffee mug where it should have been. I didn't tell anyone, but over the next week I started noticing small things aligning with the investigation. The smell of wet pavement near my front door after clear nights, a faint scuff mark in the hallway matching the pattern on her shoes, and my phone lighting up with motion alerts from the station evidence locker while I was home. Then came the radio. My personal police radio turned off on the nightstand, crackled to life at 3:11 a.m. Dispatch's voice read out coordinates, Maple and 3rd. A pause followed, longer than normal. Then, second voice, younger, uncertain, quietly asked if anyone could walk her home. I drove there immediately, half-dressed, ignoring procedure. The intersection was empty under yellow streetlights, wind pushing leaves across the curb. On the stop sign, something leaned carefully against the pole. Not the backpack, my department jacket. Story 25. My girlfriend says I talk in my sleep with someone else. We'd only lived together 3 months when she first recorded me. I'd never been told I talked in my sleep before, but she played it back over breakfast with an amused smile, expecting me to laugh. At first I did. I was clearly having a conversation, full sentences, long pauses as if listening. My tone was calm, polite, almost professional. Not the nonsense mumbling you'd expect. Then she rewound to a part where I asked a question, and a second voice answered, faint, too faint to make out words, but undeniably there. I told her it must have been noise from outside or her breathing picked up by the phone mic. She accepted that explanation until it happened again the next night, this time while she was awake. She nudged me and asked who I was talking to. Half asleep, I apparently told her to give me a second, because the other person was explaining something important. She turned on the bedside lamp. I was still asleep. The conversation continued. Over the next week, I grew exhausted without knowing why, waking feeling like I'd spent hours thinking rather than resting. She started dreading nights because every time she woke, I was mid-conversation, sometimes laughing softly, sometimes apologizing, once even asking if my partner had finished writing the report yet. I don't have a partner outside work. One night she asked the voice directly who it was. My mouth moved again, but the reply didn't come from me. It came from the far side of the room, the same tone as my sleeping speech, answering calmly that I'd been helping for days. She started sleeping at her sister's place after that. I don't blame her, because I've started waking up remembering things I never experienced. Long hallways, desk lamps glowing over paperwork, and a case file with my name listed under witness. Story 26. The body in locker 12 was already identified by someone else. Working nights at the county morgue is mostly routine. Paperwork from the hospital, intake photos, storage assignments. The police drop off remains and we log them until morning staff handles autopsies. My coworker Lena and I had an unspoken rule. No ghost stories during shift, not because we believed in them, but because boredom makes imagination loud. Locker 12 broke that rule. A John Doe arrived just after midnight. Male, mid-30s, no ID. We processed him normally, sealed the bag, and I logged him into the system. 2 hours later, the police called, asking why we'd released the body to the family already. We hadn't. They insisted a woman claiming to be his sister signed paperwork and left with the remains an hour earlier. Security footage from the front desk showed her clearly. Dark coat, calm expression, signing forms with the name matching a missing persons report filed that morning. But the body was still in locker 12. When we opened it, the toe tag was gone and replaced with a handwritten note. Thank you for keeping him safe. The next night, locker 12 opened again at 2:03 a.m. The gurney inside was empty, sheet folded neatly like someone had gotten up and made the bed. I checked every hallway. At the end of the corridor leading to the service exit, the security door stood open to the parking lot. A rain blowing inside. Wet footprints led out. 2 sets walking side by side. Story 27. My partner and I responded to a call made from a phone that was logged as evidence. I was halfway through paperwork when dispatch routed a welfare check to my car. The address didn't bother me at first. Just another apartment complex on the east side, until the caller ID flashed across the screen attached to the call notes. It was a number I recognized immediately, because I'd bagged that phone myself 3 months earlier. We'd found it at the scene of a domestic disturbance that escalated into a homicide. The victim's phone lay cracked beside the couch, screen frozen on an outgoing call that never connected. I'd sealed it, signed the chain of custody form, and watched the evidence tech place it in locker B12. Now dispatch was telling me a whispering voice had dialed 911 from that same number. My partner Ruiz laughed when I mentioned it, assuming I'd misread a digit, but the address matched the original apartment. The unit had been empty since the incident. Management refused to rent it while the trial was pending. We knocked anyway, no answer. The door stood unlocked. Inside, the apartment smelled the same as the night we processed it. Stale air, faint, cleaning chemicals, and something metallic beneath it. Furniture gone, walls bare, but in the center of the floor sat a single phone. Screen lit, call in progress. I heard dispatch faintly through it, asking if officers were on scene. Ruiz asked who had called. The speaker crackled. A second voice answered, clearer than radio static should allow. It asked if we'd finally found the other person who'd been there that night. Ruiz and I hadn't released that detail publicly. The line disconnected. Back at the station, we checked the evidence locker. The bag was still sealed. Inside it, the original phone. Story 28. My friend stayed over and someone used his voice. After he left, my friend Caleb crashed on our couch after a late movie, leaving early before sunrise because he had work. I woke just enough to hear the door close and went back to sleep. An hour later, my girlfriend nudged me awake. "Your friend's in the kitchen." I told her he'd already gone. She insisted she heard him opening cabinets, pouring cereal, humming the same off-key tune he always hummed when he stayed over. I walked out expecting him to have forgotten something. The kitchen was empty, but his backpack sat on the chair again, even though I'd watched him take it. We called him. He answered from his car halfway across town. While we were on the phone, the cabinet behind me shut softly. Caleb heard it too. He went quiet and asked if his voice sounded normal. I asked why. He said the radio in his car had just repeated his last sentence perfectly. A second after he'd spoken it, but deeper, slower, like someone learning how he talked. We hung up. Behind me, someone whispered his name from the hallway. Story 29. Night shift at the morgue. The elevator only stops on 1 floor now. Our building has 3 floors: intake, storage, and offices. The elevator shouldn't stop anywhere else, but during night shifts it began opening on level 2, repeatedly even when nobody pressed the button. At first we blamed wiring. Maintenance checked twice and found nothing wrong. Yet every night around 3:30 the doors slid open and waited as if someone were boarding. One shift my coworker Jamal joked and said, "Going up?" into the empty space. The next time it opened, a faint wet footprint appeared on the floor just inside the threshold. We followed it down the hallway. It stopped at the viewing room, used only during day hours for families identifying remains. Inside, the overhead lights were on. 2 chairs faced the glass, and on the other side, where the table should have been empty overnight, the sheet was folded down slightly, like someone had leaned forward to listen. Jamal asked out loud if someone needed help. The intercom on the wall clicked. A voice answered, asking if visiting hours were over. Story 30. The last call of my shift never appears in the report. Every officer remembers their last call of the night. It's the one you carry home, either because it was quiet and lucky or because it almost wasn't. Mine became something else entirely, because according to the system it never happened. It was near the end of a slow shift when dispatch assigned me to check on a disturbance at a small duplex near the edge of town. No panic in the dispatcher's voice, just routine. A neighbor heard arguing, lights flickering, maybe a break-in. The kind of call you clear in 10 minutes. My partner Klein stayed in the car finishing a report while I approached the front door. The porch light was off, but the interior glowed faintly, not steady, more like a television flashing in a dark room. I knocked and announced myself. The arguing stopped immediately. After a moment, the door opened halfway. A man stood there, calm, mid-30s, eyes tired but focused. He asked if someone had called us. I explained the complaint and asked if everything was all right. He said yes, that he'd just been talking loudly to his brother on the phone. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, nothing suspicious. Just a quiet home with a humming refrigerator and a hallway stretching into shadow. I asked him to keep it down and turned to leave. Then he asked me a question that didn't fit the moment. Did you ever figure out what happened here last time? I asked what he meant. He looked confused, then uneasy. He said officers had been there before, not recently, but a long time ago, and that they'd searched every room. He thought maybe I'd been one of them, because I seemed familiar. I'd never been there. Back in the patrol car, Klein asked why I'd taken so long. I told him the guy talked a bit and we cleared it. Klein frowned and asked what address I meant. I pointed to the duplex behind us. He stared. That's not the call. Dispatch had given a different number across the street. A dark house with no lights on. We checked. Empty yard, locked. Doors, no disturbance. When I radioed to confirm, dispatch said we'd cleared it already 10 minutes earlier and never assigned any secondary call. The duplex I'd entered wasn't in the system. I wrote a note to add later. Back at the station, there was no audio log of the conversation, no body cam footage for those minutes, and no entry for that address in our call history. Even my GPS showed I'd never left the patrol car's position. The next night I drove past again. The duplex existed, but the front door I'd knocked on was gone, replaced by a blank stretch of siding as if it had never been there. Story 31. My sister's boyfriend keeps visiting after she broke up with him. My sister ended things with Eric after a short relationship that never quite felt right. He wasn't aggressive or rude, just unsettling in small ways, like he always knew what she'd say before she said it, or answered questions she hadn't asked aloud yet. After the breakup, he moved out quietly, no arguments, no calls. Then she started mentioning seeing him around town, not following her, not approaching, just present, standing near her bus stop, browsing shelves in the store she'd just entered, sitting 2 rows behind her at the movies but leaving before the credits. We assumed coincidence until she came to my apartment one evening, pale and shaken. She said he'd been inside her place while she showered. She heard him in the living room speaking softly like he used to when on the phone. We checked. No forced entry, nothing missing. But 2 mugs sat on the table, both still warm. I told her to stay with me a few days. That first night, she relaxed for the first time in weeks, watching TV with my girlfriend while I cooked. Halfway through dinner, she froze and stared toward the hallway. "He's early today." I stepped out, no one there. But my phone buzzed with a door camera alert from her apartment across town. The clip showed Eric entering, sitting on the couch and waiting patiently, exactly the way he used to when she got home from work. We called the police. They found no one. My sister blocked his number and accounts. 2 nights later, she woke me at 3 a.m., saying she heard him in the kitchen making tea, the spoon tapping the mug in slow circles. I checked. Empty. But the kettle was hot and 2 cups sat on the counter. She whispered he always did that before she woke up. Last week she asked me a question I didn't know how to answer. If someone gets used to your routine enough, do they still need you there to keep doing it?